Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. Chapter 4. In the Family of Senator Jefferson Davis. The $1,200 with which I purchased the freedom of myself and son, I consented to accept only as a loan. I went to work in earnest, and in a short time paid every cent that was so kindly advanced by my lady patrons of St. Louis. All this time my husband was a source of trouble to me and a burden. Too close occupation with my needle had its effects upon my health, and feeling exhausted with work, I determined to make a change. I had a conversation with Mr. Keckley, informed him that since he persisted in dissipation, we must separate, that I was going north, and that I should never live with him again, at least until I had good evidence of his reform. He was rapidly debasing himself, and although I was willing to work for him, I was not willing to share his degradation. Poor man, he had his faults, but over these faults death has drawn a veil. My husband is now sleeping in his grave, and in a silent grave I would bury all unpleasant memories of him. I left St. Louis in the spring of 1860, taking the cars direct for Baltimore, where I stopped 6 weeks attempting to realize a sum of money by forming classes of young colored women and teaching them my system of cutting and fitting dresses. The scheme was not successful, for after 6 weeks of labor and vexation, I left Baltimore with scarcely money enough to pay my fare to Washington. Arriving in the capital, I sought and obtained work at $2.50 per day. However, as I was notified that I could only remain in the city 10 days without obtaining a license to do so, such being the law, and as I did not know whom to apply to for assistance, I was sorely troubled. I also had to have someone vouch to the authorities that I was a free woman. My means were too scanty and my profession too precarious to warrant my purchasing a license. In my perplexity, I called on a lady for whom I was sewing, Miss Ringgold, a member of General Mason's family from Virginia. I stated my case, and she kindly volunteered to render me all the assistance in her power. She called on Mayor Burritt with me, and Miss Ringgold succeeded in making an arrangement for me to remain in Washington without paying the sum required for a license. Moreover, I was not to be molested. I rented apartments in a good locality and soon had good run of custom. The summer passed, winter came, and I was still in Washington. Mrs. Davis, wife of Senator Jefferson Davis, came from the South in November of 1860 with her husband. Learning that Mrs. Davis wanted a modiste, I presented myself and was employed by her on the recommendation of one of my patrons and her intimate friend, Mrs. Captain Hetzel. I went to the house to work, but finding that they were such late risers, and as I had to fit many dresses on Mrs. Davis, I told her that I should prefer giving half the day to her, working the other in my own room for some of my other lady patrons. Mrs. D. consented to the proposition, and it was arranged that I should come to her own house every day after 12. It was the winter before the breaking out of that fierce and bloody war between the two sections of the country. And as Mr. Davis occupied a leading position, his house was the resort of politicians and statesmen from the South. Almost every night, as I learned from the servants and other members of the family, secret meetings were held at the house, and some of these meetings were protracted to a very late hour. The prospects of war were freely discussed in my presence by Mr. and Mrs. Davis and their friends. The holidays were approaching, and Mrs. Davis kept me busy in manufacturing articles of dress for herself and children. She desired to present Mr. Davis on Christmas with a handsome dressing gown. The material was purchased, and for weeks the work had been underway. Christmas Eve came, and the gown had been laid aside so often that it was still unfinished. I saw that Mrs. D. was anxious to have it completed, so I volunteered to remain and work on it. Wearily, the hours dragged on, but there was no rest for my busy fingers. I persevered in my task, notwithstanding my head was aching. Mrs. Davis was busy in the adjoining room, arranging the Christmas tree for the children. I looked at the clock, and the hands pointed to 11:15. I was arranging the cords on the gown when the senator came in. He looked somewhat careworn, and his steps seemed to be a little nervous. He leaned against the door and expressed his admiration of the Christmas tree, but there was no smile on his face. Turning round, he saw me sitting in the adjoining room and quickly exclaimed, "That's you, Lizzie! Why are you here so late? Still at work? I hope that Mrs. Davis is not too exacting." "No, sir," I answered. "Mrs. Davis was very anxious to have this gown finished tonight, and I volunteered to remain and complete it." "Well, well, the case must be urgent." And he came slowly towards me, took the gown in his hand, and asked the color of the silk. As he said, the gas light was so deceptive to his old eyes. "It is a drab, changeable silk, Mr. Davis," I answered, and might have added that it was rich and handsome, but did not, well knowing that he would make the discovery in the morning. He smiled curiously, but turned and walked from the room without another question. He inferred that the gown was for him, that it was to be the Christmas present from his wife, and he did not wish to destroy the pleasure that she would experience in believing that the gift would prove a surprise. In this respect, as in many others, he always appeared to me as a thoughtful, considerate man in the domestic circle. As the clock struck 12, I finished the gown, little dreaming of the future that was before it. It was worn, I have not the shadow of a doubt, by Mr. Davis during the stormy years that he was the President of the Confederate States. The holidays passed, and before the close of January, the war was discussed in Mr. Davis's family as an event certain to happen in the future. Mrs. Davis was warmly attached to Washington, and I often heard her say that she disliked the idea of breaking up old associations and going south to suffer from trouble and deprivation. One day, while discussing the question in my presence with one of her intimate friends, she exclaimed, "I would rather remain in Washington and be kicked about than go south and be Mrs. President." Her friend expressed surprise at the remark, and Mrs. Davis insisted that the opinion was an honest one. While dressing her one day, she said to me, "Lizzie, you are so very handy that I should like to take you south with me." "When do you go south, Mrs. Davis?" I inquired. "Oh, I cannot tell just now, but it will be soon. You know there is going to be a war, Lizzie." "No, but I tell you yes." "Who will go to war?" I asked. "The North and South," was her ready reply. "The Southern people will not submit to the humiliating demands of the Abolition Party. They will fight first." "And which do you think will whip?" "The South, of course. The South is impulsive, is in earnest, and the Southern soldiers will fight to conquer. The North will yield when it sees the South is in earnest, rather than engage in a long and bloody war." "But, Mrs. Davis, are you certain that there will be war?" "Certain? I know it. You had better go south with me. I will take good care of you. Besides, when the war breaks out, the colored people will suffer in the North. The Northern people will look upon them as the cause of the war, and I fear, in their exasperation, will be inclined to treat you harshly. Then I may come back to Washington in a few months and live in the White House. The Southern people talk of choosing Mr. Davis for their president. In fact, it may be considered settled that he will be their president. As soon as we go south and succeed from the other states, we will raise an army and march on Washington, and then I shall live in the White House." I was bewildered with what I heard. I had served Mrs. Davis faithfully, and she had learned to place the greatest confidence in me. At first, I was almost tempted to go south with her, for her reasoning seemed plausible. At the time, the conversation was closed, with my promise to consider the question. I thought over the question much, and the more I thought, the less inclined I felt to accept the proposition so kindly made by Mrs. Davis. I knew the North to be strong and believed that the people would fight for the flag that they pretended to venerate so highly. The Republican Party had just emerged from a heated campaign, flushed with victory, and I could not think that the hosts composing the party would quietly yield all they had gained in the presidential canvass. A show of war from the South, I felt, would lead to actual war in the North, and with the two sections bitterly arrayed against each other, I preferred to cast my lot among the people of the North. I parted with Mrs. Davis kindly, half promising to join her in the South if further deliberation should induce me to change my views. A few weeks before she left Washington, I made 2 chintz wrappers for her. She said that she must give up expensive dressing for a while, and that she, with the Southern people, now that war was imminent, must learn to practice lessons of economy. She left some fine needlework in my hands, which I finished and forwarded to her at Montgomery, Alabama, in the month of June, through the assistance of Mrs. Emery, one of her oldest and best friends. Since bidding them goodbye at Washington early in the year 1860, I have never met any of the Davis family. Years of excitement, years of bloodshed, and hundreds of thousands of graves intervene between the months I spent in the family and now. The years have brought many changes, and in view of these terrible changes, even I, who was once a slave, who have been punished with the cruel lash, who have experienced the heart and soul tortures of a slave's life, can say to Mr. Jefferson Davis, "Peace, you have suffered, go in peace." In the winter of 1865, I was in Chicago, and one day visited the great charity fair held for the benefit of the families of those soldiers who were killed or wounded during the war. In one part of the building was a wax figure of Jefferson Davis, wearing over his other garments the dress in which it was reported that he was captured. There was always a great crowd around this figure, and I was naturally attracted towards it. I worked my way to the figure, and in examining the dress made the pleasing discovery that it was one of the chintz wrappers that I had made for Mrs. Davis a short time before she departed from Washington for the South. When it was announced that I recognized the dress as one that I had made for the wife of the late Confederate president, there was great cheering and excitement, and I at once became the object of the deepest curiosity. Great crowds followed me, and in order to escape from the embarrassing situation, I left the building. I believe it now is pretty well established that Mr. Davis had on a waterproof cloak instead of a dress, as first reported when he was captured. This does not invalidate any portion of my story. The dress on the wax figure at the fair in Chicago unquestionably was one of the chintz wrappers that I made for Mrs. Davis in January 1860 in Washington, and I infer, since it was not found on the body of the fugitive president of the South, it was taken from the trunks of Mrs. Davis, captured at the same time. Be this as it may, the coincidence is none the less striking and curious. End of chapter. Chapter 5. My Introduction to Mrs. Lincoln. Ever since arriving in Washington, I had a great desire to work for the ladies of the White House, and to accomplish this end, I was ready to make almost any sacrifice consistent with propriety. Work came in slowly, and I was beginning to feel very much embarrassed, for I did not know how I was to meet the bills staring me in the face. It is true, the bills were small, but then they were formidable to me, who had little or nothing to pay them with. While in this situation, I called at the Ringolds, where I met Mrs. Captain Lee. Mrs. L. was in a state bordering on excitement as the great event of the season, the dinner party given in honor of the Prince of Wales, was soon to come off, and she must have a dress suitable for the occasion. The silk had been purchased, but a dressmaker had not yet been found. Miss Ringgold recommended me, and I received the order to make the dress. When I called on Mrs. Lee the next day, her husband was in the room, and handing me a roll of bank bills amounting to $100, he requested me to purchase the trimmings and to spare no expense in making a selection. With the money in my pocket, I went out in the street, entered the store of Harper and Mitchell, and asked to look at their laces. Mr. Harper waited on me himself and was polite and kind. When I asked permission to carry the laces to Mrs. Lee in order to learn whether she could approve my selection or not, he gave a ready assent. When I reminded him that I was a stranger and that the goods were valuable, he remarked that he was not afraid to trust me, that he believed my face was the index to an honest heart. It was pleasant to be spoken to thus, and I shall never forget the kind words of Mr. Harper. I often recall them, for they are associated with the dawn of a brighter period in my dark life. I purchased the trimmings, and Mr. Harper allowed me a commission of $25 on the purchase. The dress was done in time, and it gave complete satisfaction. Mrs. Lee attracted great attention at the dinner party, and her elegant dress proved a good card for me. I received numerous orders and was relieved from all pecuniary embarrassments. One of my patrons was Mrs. General McLean, a daughter of General Sumner. One day, when I was very busy, Mrs. McC drove up to my apartments, came in where I was engaged with my needle, and in her emphatic way said, "Lizzie, I am invited to dine at Willard's on next Sunday, and positively I have not a dress fit to wear on the occasion. I have just purchased material, and you must commence work on it right away." "But, Mrs. McLean," I replied, "I have more work now promised than I can do. It is impossible for me to make a dress for you to wear on Sunday next." "Pshaw, nothing is impossible. I must have the dress made by Sunday." And she spoke with some impatience. "I am sorry," I began, but she interrupted me. "Now, don't say no again. I tell you that you must make the dress. I have often heard you say that you would like to work for the ladies of the White House. Well, I have it in my power to obtain you this privilege. I know Mrs. Lincoln well, and you shall make a dress for her, provided you finish mine in time to wear at dinner on Sunday." The inducement was the best that could have been offered. I would undertake the dress if I should have to sit up all night, every night, to make my pledge good. I sent out and employed assistants, and after much worry and trouble, the dress was completed to the satisfaction of Mrs. McLean. It appears that Mrs. Lincoln had upset a cup of coffee on the dress she designed wearing on the evening of the reception after the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States, which rendered it necessary that she should have a new one for the occasion. On asking Mrs. McLean who her dressmaker was, the lady promptly informed her, "Lizzie Keckley." "Lizzie Keckley? The name is familiar to me. She used to work for some of my lady friends in St. Louis, and they spoke well of her. Can you recommend her to me?" "With confidence. Shall I send her to you?" "If you please. I shall feel under many obligations for your kindness." The next Sunday, Mrs. McLean sent me a message to call at her house at 4:00 p.m. that day. As she did not state why I was to call, I determined to wait till Monday morning. Monday morning came, and 9:00 found me at Mrs. McC's house. The streets of the capital were thronged with people, for this was Inauguration Day. A new president, a man of the people from the broad prairies of the West, was to accept the solemn oath of office, was to assume the responsibilities attached to the high position of Chief Magistrate of the United States. Never was such deep interest felt in the inauguration proceedings as was felt today, for threats of assassination had been made, and every breeze from the South came heavily laden with the rumors of war. Around Willard's Hotel swayed an excited crowd, and it was with the utmost difficulty that I worked my way to the house on the opposite side of the street, occupied by the McLeans. Mrs. McLean was out, but presently an aide on General McLean's staff called and informed me that I was wanted at Willard's. I crossed the street and on entering the hotel was met by Mrs. McLean, who greeted me. "Lizzie, why did you not come yesterday as I requested? Mrs. Lincoln wanted to see you, but I fear that now you are too late." "I am sorry, Mrs. McLean. You did not say what you wanted with me yesterday, so I judged that this morning would do as well." "You should have come yesterday," she insisted. "Go up to Mrs. Lincoln's room. Give me the number. She may find use for you yet." With a nervous step, I passed on and knocked at Mrs. Lincoln's door. A cheery voice bade me come in, and a lady, inclined to stoutness, about 40 years of age, stood before me. "You are Lizzie Keckley, I believe." I bowed assent. "The dressmaker that Mrs. McLean recommended?" "Yes, madam." "Very well. I have not time to talk to you now, but would like to have you call at the White House at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, where I shall then be." I bowed myself out of the room and returned to my apartments. The day passed slowly, for I could not help but speculate in relation to the appointed interview for the morrow. My long-cherished hope was about to be realized, and I could not rest. Tuesday morning at 8 o'clock, I crossed the threshold of the White House for the first time. I was shown into a waiting room and informed that Mrs. Lincoln was at breakfast. In the waiting room, I found no less than 3 mantua makers waiting for an interview with the wife of the new president. It seems that Mrs. Lincoln had told several of her lady friends that she had urgent need for a dressmaker, and that each of these friends had sent her mantua maker to the White House. Hope fell at once. With so many rivals for the position sought after, I regarded my chances for success as extremely doubtful. I was the last one summoned to Mrs. Lincoln's presence. All the others had a hearing and were dismissed. I went upstairs timidly and, entering the room with nervous step, discovered the wife of the president standing by a window looking out and engaged in lively conversation with a lady, Mrs. Grimsley. As I afterwards learned, Mrs. L. came forward and greeted me warmly. "You have come at last, Mrs. Keckley. Who have you worked for in the city?" "Among others, Mrs. Senator Davis has been one of my best patrons," was my reply. "Mrs. Davis? So you have worked for her, have you? Of course you gave satisfaction. So far, good. Can you do my work?" "Yes, Mrs. Lincoln. Will you have much work for me to do?" "That, Mrs. Keckley, will depend altogether upon your prices. I trust that your terms are reasonable. I cannot afford to be extravagant. We are just from the West and are poor. If you do not charge too much, I shall be able to give you all my work." "I do not think there will be any difficulty about charges, Mrs. Lincoln. My terms are reasonable." "Well, if you will work cheap, you shall have plenty to do. I can't afford to pay big prices, so I frankly tell you so in the beginning." The terms were satisfactorily arranged, and I measured Mrs. Lincoln, took the dress with me, a bright rose-colored moire antique, and returned the next day to fit it on her. A number of ladies were in the room, all making preparations for the levee to come off on Friday night. These ladies, I learned, were relatives of Mrs. L's, Mrs. Edwards and Mrs. Kellogg, her own sisters, and Elizabeth Edwards and Julia Baker, her nieces. Mrs. Lincoln this morning was dressed in a cashmere wrapper, quilted down the front, and she wore a simple headdress. The other ladies wore mourning robes. I was hard at work on the dress when I was informed that the levee had been postponed from Friday night till Tuesday night. This, of course, gave me more time to complete my task. Mrs. Lincoln sent for me and suggested some alteration in style, which was made. She also requested that I make a waist of blue watered silk for Mrs. Grimsley, as work on the dress would not require all my time. Tuesday evening came, and I had taken the last stitches on the dress. I folded it and carried it to the White House, with the waist for Mrs. Grimsley. When I went upstairs, I found the ladies in a terrible state of excitement. Mrs. Lincoln was protesting that she could not go down for the reason that she had nothing to wear. "Mrs. Keckley, you have disappointed me, deceived me. Why do you bring my dress at this late hour?" "Because I have just finished it, and I thought I should be in time." "But you are not in time, Mrs. Keckley. You have bitterly disappointed me. I have no time now to dress, and what is more, I will not dress and go downstairs." "I am sorry if I have disappointed you, Mrs. Lincoln, for I intended to be in time. Will you let me dress you? I can have you ready in a few minutes." "No, I won't be dressed. I will stay in my room. Mr. Lincoln can go down with the other ladies." "But there is plenty of time for you to dress, Mary," joined in Mrs. Grimsley and Mrs. Edwards. "Let Mrs. Keckley assist you, and she will soon have you ready." Thus urged, she consented. I dressed her hair and arranged the dress on her. It fitted nicely, and she was pleased. Mr. Lincoln came in, threw himself on the sofa, laughed with Willie and little Tad, and then commenced pulling on his gloves, quoting poetry all the while. "You seem to be in a poetical mood tonight," said his wife. "Yes, Mother, these are poetical times," was his pleasant reply. "I declare, you look charming in that dress. Mrs. Keckley has met with great success." And then he proceeded to compliment the other ladies. Mrs. Lincoln looked elegant in her rose-colored moire antique. She wore a pearl necklace, pearl earrings, pearl bracelets, and red roses in her hair. Mrs. Baker was dressed in lemon-colored silk, Mrs. Kellogg in a drab silk, ashes of rose, Mrs. Edwards in a brown and black silk, Miss Edwards in crimson, and Mrs. Grimsley in blue-watered silk. Just before starting downstairs, Mrs. Lincoln's lace handkerchief was the object of search. It had been displaced by Tad, who was mischievous and hard to restrain. The handkerchief found, all became serene. Mrs. Lincoln took the president's arm and with smiling face led the train below. I was surprised at her grace and composure. I had heard so much in current and malicious report of her low life, of her ignorance and vulgarity, that I expected to see her embarrassed on this occasion. Report, I soon saw, was wrong. No queen, accustomed to the usages of royalty all her life, could have comported herself with more calmness and dignity than did the wife of the president. She was confident and self-possessed, and confidence always gives grace. This levee was a brilliant one, and the only one of the season. I became the regular modiste of Mrs. Lincoln. I made 15 or 16 dresses for her during the spring and early part of the summer when she left Washington, spending the hot weather at Saratoga, Long Branch, and other places. In the meantime, I was employed by Mrs. Senator Douglas, one of the loveliest ladies that I ever met, Mrs. Secretary Wells, Mrs. Secretary Stanton, and others. Mrs. Douglas was always dressed in deep mourning with excellent taste, and several of the leading ladies of Washington society were extremely jealous of her superior attractions. End of chapter. Chapter 6. Willie Lincoln's Deathbed. Mrs. Lincoln returned to Washington in November, and again duty called me to the White House. The war was now in progress, and every day brought stirring news from the front where the gray opposed the blue, where flashed the bright saber in the sunshine, where we heard the angry notes of battle, the deep roar of cannon, and the fearful rattle of musketry, where new graves were being made every day, where brother forgot a mother's early blessing and sought the life-blood of brother, and friend raised the deadly knife against friend. Oh, the front, with its stirring battle scenes. Oh, the front, with its ghastly heaps of dead. The life of the nation was at stake, and when the land was full of sorrow, there could not be much gaiety at the Capitol. The days passed quietly with me. I soon learned that some people had an intense desire to penetrate the inner circle of the White House. No president and his family, heretofore occupying this mansion, ever excited so much curiosity as the present incumbents. Mr. Lincoln had grown up in the wilds of the West, and evil report had said much of him and his wife. The polite world was shocked, and the tendency to exaggerate intensified curiosity. As soon as it was known that I was the modiste of Mrs. Lincoln, parties crowded around and affected friendship for me, hoping to induce me to betray the secrets of the domestic circle. One day a woman, I will not call her a lady, drove up to my rooms, gave me an order to make a dress, and insisted on partly paying me in advance. She called on me every day and was exceedingly kind. When she came to take her dress away, she cautiously remarked, "Mrs. Keckley, you know Mrs. Lincoln?" "Yes." "You are her modiste, are you not?" "Yes." "You know her very well, do you not?" "I am with her every day or two." "Don't you think you would have some influence with her?" "I cannot say. Mrs. Lincoln, I presume, would listen to anything I should suggest, but whether she would be influenced by a suggestion of mine is another question." "I am sure that you could influence her, Mrs. Keckley. Now listen, I have a proposition to make. I have a great desire to become an inmate of the White House. I have heard so much of Mr. Lincoln's goodness that I should like to be near him, and if I can enter the White House no other way, I am willing to go as a menial. My dear Mrs. Keckley, will you not recommend me to Mrs. Lincoln as a friend of yours out of employment, and ask her to take me as a chambermaid? If you will do this, you shall be well rewarded. It may be worth several $1,000s to you in time." I looked at the woman in amazement. A bribe, and to betray the confidence of my employer? Turning to her with a glance of scorn, I said, "Madam, you are mistaken in regard to my character. Sooner than betray the trust of a friend, I would throw myself into the Potomac River. I am not so base as that. Pardon me, but there's the door, and I trust that you will never enter my room again." She sprang to her feet in deep confusion and passed through the door, murmuring, "Very well, you will live to regret your action today." "Never, never," I exclaimed, and closed the door after her with a bang. I afterwards learned that this woman was an actress, and that her object was to enter the White House as a servant, learn its secrets, and then publish a scandal to the world. I do not give her name, for such publicity would wound the sensitive feelings of friends who would have to share her disgrace without being responsible for her faults. I simply record the incident to show how I often was approached by unprincipled parties. It is unnecessary to say that I indignantly refused every bribe offered. The first public appearance of Mrs. Lincoln that winter was at the reception of New Year's Day. This reception was shortly followed by a brilliant levee. The day after the levee, I went to the White House, and while fitting a dress to Mrs. Lincoln, she said, "Lizabeth," she had learned to drop the E, "Lizabeth, I have an idea. These are war times, and we must be as economical as possible. You know the president is expected to give a series of state dinners every winter, and these dinners are very costly. Now, I want to avoid this expense, and my idea is that if I give 3 large receptions, the state dinners can be scratched from the program. What do you think, Lizabeth?" "I think that you are right, Mrs. Lincoln." "I am glad to hear you say so. If I can make Mr. Lincoln take the same view of the case, I shall not fail to put the idea into practice." Before I left her room that day, Mr. Lincoln came in. She at once stated the case to him. He pondered the question a few moments before answering, "Mother, I'm afraid your plan will not work." But it will work if you will only determine that it shall work. It is breaking in on the regular custom, he mildly replied. But you forget, Father, these are war times, and old customs can be done away with for the once. The idea is economical, you must admit. Yes, Mother, but we must think of something besides economy. I do think of something else. Public receptions are more democratic than stupid state dinners, are more in keeping with the spirit of the institutions of our country, as you would say if called upon to make a stump speech. There are a great many strangers in the city, foreigners and others, whom we can entertain at our receptions, but whom we cannot invite to our dinners. I believe you are right, Mother. You argue the point well. I think that we shall have to decide on the receptions. So the day was carried. The question was decided, and arrangements were made for the first reception. It was now January, and cards were issued for February. The children, Tad and Willie, were constantly receiving presents. Willie was so delighted with a little pony that he insisted on riding it every day. The weather was changeable, and exposure resulted in a severe cold, which deepened into fever. He was very sick, and I was summoned to his bedside. It was sad to see the poor boy suffer. Always of a delicate constitution, he could not resist the strong inroads of disease. The days dragged wearily by, and he grew weaker and more shadow-like. He was his mother's favorite child, and she doted on him. It grieved her heart sorely to see him suffer. When able to be about, he was almost constantly by her side. When I would go in her room, almost always I found blue-eyed Willie there, reading from an open book or curled up in a chair with pencil and paper in hand. He had decidedly a literary taste and was a studious boy. A short time before his death, he wrote this simple little poem. Washington, D.C., October 30th, 1861. Dear Sir, I enclose you my first attempt at poetry. Yours truly, William W. Lincoln. To the editor of the National Republican, lines on the death of Colonel Edward Baker. There was no patriot like Baker, so noble and so true. He fell as a soldier on the field, his face to the sky of blue. His voice is silent in the hall, which oft his presence graced. No more he'll hear the loud acclaim, which rang from place to place. No squeamish notions filled his breast, the Union was his theme. No surrender and no compromise, his day, thought, and night's dream. His country was her part to pay towards those he has left behind. His widow and his children all she must always keep in mind. Finding that Willie continued to grow worse, Mrs. Lincoln determined to withdraw her cards of invitation and postpone the reception. Mr. Lincoln thought that the cards had better not be withdrawn. At least he advised that the doctor be consulted before any steps were taken. Accordingly, Dr. Stone was called in. He pronounced Willie better, and said that there was every reason for an early recovery. He thought, since the invitations had been issued, it would be best to go on with the reception. Willie, he insisted, was in no immediate danger. Mrs. Lincoln was guided by these counsels, and no postponement was announced. On the evening of the reception, Willie was suddenly taken worse. His mother sat by his bedside a long while, holding his feverish hand in her own and watching his labored breathing. The doctor claimed there was no cause for alarm. I arranged Mrs. Lincoln's hair, then assisted her to dress. Her dress was white satin, trimmed with black lace. The trail was very long, and as she swept through the room, Mr. Lincoln was standing with his back to the fire, his hands behind him, and his eyes on the carpet. His face wore a thoughtful, solemn look. The rustling of the satin dress attracted his attention. He looked at it a few moments, then in his quaint, quiet way remarked, "Whew, our cat has a long tail tonight." Mrs. Lincoln did not reply. The president added, "Mother, it is my opinion, if some of that tail was nearer the head, it would be in better style," and he glanced at her bare arms and neck. She had a beautiful neck and arm, and low dresses were becoming to her. She turned away with a look of offended dignity, and presently took the president's arm, and both went downstairs to their guests, leaving me alone with the sick boy. The reception was a large and brilliant one, and the rich notes of the Marine Band in the apartments below came to the sick room in soft, subdued murmurs, like the wild, faint sobbing of far-off spirits. Some of the young people had suggested dancing, but Mr. Lincoln met the suggestion with an emphatic veto. The brilliance of the scene could not dispel the sadness that rested upon the face of Mrs. Lincoln. During the evening she came upstairs several times and stood by the bedside of the suffering boy. She loved him with a mother's heart, and her anxiety was great. The night passed slowly. Morning came, and Willie was worse. He lingered a few days and died. God called the beautiful spirit home, and the house of joy was turned into the house of mourning. I was worn out with watching, and was not in the room when Willie died, but was immediately sent for. I assisted in washing him and dressing him, and then laid him on the bed when Mr. Lincoln came in. I never saw a man so bowed down with grief. He came to the bed, lifted the cover from the face of his child, gazed at it long and earnestly, murmuring, "My poor boy, he was too good for this earth. God has called him home. I know that he is much better off in heaven, but then we loved him so. It is hard to have him die." Great sobs choked his utterance. He buried his head in his hands, and his tall frame was convulsed with emotion. I stood at the foot of the bed, my eyes full of tears, looking at the man in silent, awe-stricken wonder. His grief unnerved him, and made him a weak, passive child. I did not dream that his rugged nature could be so moved. I shall never forget those solemn moments, genius and greatness weeping over love's idol lost. There is a grandeur as well as a simplicity about the picture that will never fade. With me, it is immortal. I really believe that I shall carry it with me across the dark, mysterious river of death. Mrs. Lincoln's grief was inconsolable. The pale face of her dead boy threw her into convulsions. Around him, love's tendrils had been twined, and now that he was dressed for the tomb, it was like tearing the tendrils out of the heart by their roots. Willie, she often said, if spared by Providence, would be the hope and stay of her old age. But Providence had not spared him. The light faded from his eyes, and the death dew had gathered on his brow. In one of her paroxysms of grief, the president kindly bent over his wife, took her by the arm, and gently led her to the window. With a stately, solemn gesture, he pointed to the lunatic asylum. "Mother, do you see that large white building on the hill yonder? Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there." Mrs. Lincoln was so completely overwhelmed with sorrow that she did not attend the funeral. Willie was laid to rest in the cemetery, and the White House was draped in mourning. Black crape everywhere met the eye, contrasting strangely with the gay and brilliant colors of a few days before. Party dresses were laid aside, and everyone who crossed the threshold of the presidential mansion spoke in subdued tones when they thought of the sweet boy at rest. Under the sod and the dew. Previous to this, I had lost my son. Leaving Wilberforce, he went to the battlefield with the 3 months' troops and was killed in Missouri, found his grave on the battlefield where the gallant General Lyon fell. It was a sad blow to me, and the kind womanly letter that Mrs. Lincoln wrote to me when she heard of my bereavement was full of golden words of comfort. Nathaniel Parker Willis, the genial poet, now sleeping in his grave, wrote this beautiful sketch of Willie Lincoln after the sad death of the bright-eyed boy. This little fellow had his acquaintances among his father's friends, and I chanced to be one of them. He never failed to seek me out in the crowd, shake hands, and make some pleasant remark, and this, in a boy of 10 years of age, was, to say the least, endearing to a stranger. But he had more than mere affectionateness. His self-possession, aplomb, as the French call it, was extraordinary. I was one day passing the White House when he was outside with a playfellow on the sidewalk. Mr. Seward drove in with Prince Napoleon and 2 of his suite in the carriage. And, in a mock heroic way, terms of intimacy evidently existing between the boy and the secretary, the official gentleman took off his hat, and the Napoleon did the same, all making the young Prince President a ceremonious salute. Not a bit staggered with the homage, Willie drew himself up to his full height, took off his little cap with graceful self-possession, and bowed down formally to the ground like a little ambassador. They drove past, and he went on unconcernedly with his play, the impromptu readiness and good judgment being clearly a part of his nature. His genial and open expression of countenance was none the less ingenuous and fearless for a certain tincture of fun, and it was in this mingling of qualities that he so faithfully resembled his father. With all the splendor that was around this little fellow in his new home, he was so bravely and beautifully himself, and that only. A wild flower transplanted from the prairie to the hothouse, he retained his prairie habits, unalterably pure and simple, till he died. His leading trait seemed to be a fearless and kindly frankness, willing that everything should be as different as it pleased, but resting unmoved in his own conscious single-heartedness. I found I was studying him irresistibly as one of the sweet problems of childhood that the world is blessed with in rare places, and the news of his death— I was absent from Washington on a visit to my own children at the time— came to me like a knell heard unexpectedly at a merrymaking. On the day of the funeral, I went before the hour to take a near farewell look at the dear boy, for they had embalmed him to send home to the West, to sleep under the sod of his own valley, and the coffin lid was to be closed before the service. The family had just taken their leave of him, and the servants and nurses were seeing him for the last time, and with tears and sobs wholly unrestrained, for he was loved like an idol by every one of them. He lay with eyes closed, his brown hair parted as we had known it, pale in a slumber of death, but otherwise unchanged, for he was dressed as if for the evening, and held in one of his hands, crossed upon his breast, a bunch of exquisite flowers, a message coming from his mother while we were looking upon him that those flowers might be preserved for her. She was lying sick in her bed, worn out with grief and overwatching. The funeral was very touching. Of the entertainments in the East Room, the boy had been, for those who now assembled more especially, a most life-giving variation. With his bright face and his apt greetings and replies, he was remembered in every part of that crimson-curtained hall, built only for pleasure, of all the crowds each night, certainly the one least likely to be death's first mark. He was his father's favorite. They were intimates, often seen hand in hand, and there sat the man, with a burden on his brain at which the world marvels, bent now, with the load at both heart and brain, staggering under a blow like the taking from him of his child. His men of power sat around him, McClellan, with a moist eye when he bowed to the prayer, as I could see from where I stood, and Chase and Seward, with their austere features at work, and senators and ambassadors and soldiers, all struggling with their tears, great hearts sorrowing with the president as a stricken man and a brother. That God may give him strength for all his burdens is, I am sure, at present the prayer of a nation. This sketch was very much admired by Mrs. Lincoln. I copy it from the scrapbook in which she pasted it, with many tears, with her own hands. End of chapter. Chapter 7. Washington in 1862 to 1863. In the summer of 1862, freedmen began to flock into Washington from Maryland and Virginia. They came with a great hope in their hearts, and with all their worldly goods on their backs. Fresh from the bonds of slavery, fresh from the benighted regions of the plantation, they came to the capital looking for liberty, and many of them not knowing it when they found it. Many good friends reached forth kind hands, but the North is not warm and impulsive. For one kind word spoken, 2 harsh ones were uttered. There was something repelling in the atmosphere, and the bright, joyous dreams of freedom to the slave faded, were sadly altered in the presence of that stern, practical mother, reality. Instead of flowery paths, days of perpetual sunshine, and bowers hanging with golden fruit, the road was rugged and full of thorns, the sunshine was eclipsed by shadows, and the mute appeals for help too often were answered by cold neglect. Poor dusky children of slavery, men and women of my own race, the transition from slavery to freedom was too sudden for you. The bright dreams were too rudely dispelled. You were not prepared for the new life that opened before you, and the great masses of the North learned to look upon your helplessness with indifference, learned to speak of you as an idle, dependent race. Reason should have prompted kinder thoughts. Charity is ever kind. One fair summer evening, I was walking the streets of Washington, accompanied by a friend, when a band of music was heard in the distance. We wondered what it could mean, and curiosity prompted us to find out its meaning. We quickened our steps and discovered that it came from the house of Mrs. Farnham. The yard was brilliantly lighted, ladies and gentlemen were moving about, and the band was playing some of its sweetest airs. We approached the sentinel on duty at the gate and asked what was going on. He told us that it was a festival given for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers in the city. This suggestion an idea to me. If the white people can give festivals to raise funds for the relief of suffering soldiers, why should not the well-to-do colored people go to work to do something for the benefit of the suffering blacks? I could not rest. The thought was ever present with me, and the next Sunday I made a suggestion in the colored church that a society of colored people be formed to labor for the benefit of the unfortunate freedmen. The idea proved popular, and in 2 weeks, the Contraband Relief Association was organized with 40 working members. In September of 1862, Mrs. Lincoln left Washington for New York and requested me to follow her in a few days and join her at the Metropolitan Hotel. I was glad of the opportunity to do so, for I thought that in New York I would be able to do something in the interest of our society. Armed with credentials, I took the train for New York and went to the Metropolitan, where Mrs. Lincoln had secured accommodations for me. The next morning, I told Mrs. Lincoln of my project, and she immediately headed my list with a subscription of $200. I circulated among the colored people and got them thoroughly interested in the subject, when I was called to Boston by Mrs. Lincoln, who wished to visit her son Robert, attending college in that city. I met Mr. Wendell Phillips and other Boston philanthropists who gave me all the assistance in their power. We held a mass meeting at the Colored Baptist Church. Reverend Mr. Grimes in Boston raised a sum of money and organized there a branch society. The society was organized by Mrs. Grimes, wife of the pastor, assisted by Mrs. Martin, wife of Reverend Stella Martin. This branch of the main society during the war was able to send us over 80 large boxes of goods contributed exclusively by the colored people of Boston. Returning to New York, we held a successful meeting at the Shiloh Church. Reverend Henry Highland Garnett, pastor. The Metropolitan Hotel, at that time as now, employed colored help. I suggested the object of my mission to Robert Thompson, steward of the hotel, who immediately raised quite a sum of money among the dining room waiters. Mr. Frederick Douglass contributed $200, besides lecturing for us. Other prominent colored men sent in liberal contributions. From England, a large quantity of stores was received. Mrs. Lincoln made frequent contributions, as also did the President. In 1863, I was re-elected President of the Association, which office I continue to hold. For 2 years after Willie's death, the White House was the scene of no fashionable display. The memory of the dead boy was duly respected. In some things, Mrs. Lincoln was an altered woman. Sometimes, when in her room, with no one present but myself, the mere mention of Willie's name would excite her emotion, and any trifling memento that recalled him would move her to tears. She could not bear to look upon his picture, and after his death she never crossed the threshold of the guest room in which he died, or the green room in which he was embalmed. There was something supernatural in her dread of these things, and something that she could not explain. Tad's nature was the opposite of Willie's, and he was always regarded as his father's favorite child. His black eyes fairly sparkled with mischief. The war progressed. Fair fields had been stained with blood. Thousands of brave men had fallen, and thousands of eyes were weeping for the fallen at home. There were desolate hearthstones in the South as well as in the North, and as the people of my race watched the sanguinary struggle, the ebb and flow of the tide of battle, they lifted their faces Zionward, as if they hoped to catch a glimpse of the promised land beyond a sulphurous clouds of smoke which shifted now and then, but to reveal ghastly rows of new-made graves. Sometimes the very life of the nation seemed to tremble with the fierce shock of arms. In 1863, the Confederates were flushed with victory, and sometimes it looked as if the proud flag of the Union, the glorious old stars and stripes, must yield half its nationality to the tri-barred flag that floated grandly over long columns of gray. These were sad, anxious days to Mr. Lincoln, and those who saw the man in privacy only could tell how much he suffered. One day he came into the room where I was fitting a dress on Mrs. Lincoln. His step was slow and heavy, and his face sad. Like a tired child, he threw himself upon a sofa and shaded his eyes with his hands. He was a complete picture of dejection. Mrs. Lincoln, observing his troubled look, asked, "Where have you been, Father?" "To the War Department," was the brief, almost sullen answer. "Any news?" "Yes, plenty of news, but no good news. It is dark, dark everywhere." He reached forth one of his long arms and took a small Bible from a stand near the head of the sofa, opened the pages of the Holy Book, and soon was absorbed in reading them. A quarter of an hour passed, and on glancing at the sofa, the face of the President seemed more cheerful. The dejected look was gone, and the countenance was lighted up with new resolution and hope. The change was so marked that I could not but wonder at it, and wonder led to the desire to know what book of the Bible afforded so much comfort to the reader. Making the search for a missing article an excuse, I walked gently around the sofa, and looking into the open book, I discovered that Mr. Lincoln was reading that divine comforter, Job. He read with Christian eagerness, and the courage and hope that he derived from the inspired pages made him a new man. I almost imagined that I could hear the Lord speaking to him from out the whirlwind of battle. "Gird up thy loins now like a man. I will demand of thee, and declare thou unto me." What a sublime picture was this, a ruler of a mighty nation going to the pages of the Bible with simple Christian earnestness for comfort and courage, and finding both in the darkest hours of a nation's calamity. Ponder it, O ye scoffers at God's holy word, and then hang your heads for very shame. Frequent letters were received warning Mr. Lincoln of assassination, but he never gave a second thought to the mysterious warnings. The letters, however, sorely troubled his wife. She seemed to read impending danger in every rustling leaf, in every whisper of the wind. "Where are you going now, father?" she would say to him as she observed him putting on his overshoes and shawl. "I am going over to the War Department, mother, to try and learn some news." "But, father, you should not go out alone. You know you are surrounded with danger." "All imagination. What does anyone want to harm me for? Don't worry about me, mother, as if I were a little child, for no one is going to molest me." And with a confident, unsuspecting air, he would close the door behind him, descend the stairs, and pass out to his lonely walk. For weeks, when trouble was anticipated, friends of the president would sleep in the White House to guard him from danger. Robert would come home every few months, bringing new joy to the family circle. He was very anxious to quit school and enter the army, but the move was sternly opposed by his mother. "We have lost one son, and his loss is as much as I can bear without being called upon to make another sacrifice," she would say when the subject was under discussion. "But many a poor mother has given up all her sons," mildly suggested Mr. Lincoln, "and our son is not more dear to us than the sons of other people are to their mothers." "That may be, but I cannot bear to have Robert exposed to danger. His services are not required in the field, and the sacrifice would be a needless one." "The services of every man who loves his country are required in this war. You should take a liberal instead of a selfish view of the question, mother." Argument at last prevailed, and permission was granted Robert to enter the army. With the rank of captain and ADC, he went to the field and remained in the army till the close of the war. I well recollect a little incident that gave me a clearer insight into Robert's character. He was at home at the time the Tom Thumb combination was at Washington. The marriage of little hopo my thumb Charles Stratton to Miss Warren created no little excitement in the world, and the people of Washington participated in the general curiosity. Some of Mrs. Lincoln's friends made her believe that it was the duty of Mrs. Lincoln to show some attention to the remarkable dwarfs. Tom Thumb had been caressed by royalty in the Old World, and why should not the wife of the president of his native country smile upon him also? Verily, duty is one of the greatest bugbears in life. A hasty reception was arranged, and cards of invitation issued. I had dressed Mrs. Lincoln, and she was ready to go below and receive her guests, when Robert entered his mother's room. "You are at leisure this afternoon, are you not, Robert?" "Yes, mother." "Of course, then, you will dress and come downstairs." "No, mother, I do not propose to assist in entertaining Tom Thumb. My notions of duty, perhaps, are somewhat different from yours." Robert had a lofty soul, and he could not stoop to all of the follies and absurdities of the ephemeral current of fashionable life. Mrs. Lincoln's love for her husband sometimes prompted her to act very strangely. She was extremely jealous of him, and if a lady desired to court her displeasure, she could select no surer way to do it than to pay marked attention to the president. These little jealous freaks often were a source of perplexity to Mr. Lincoln. If it was a reception for which they were dressing, he would come into her room to conduct her downstairs, and while pulling on his gloves, ask, with a merry twinkle in his eyes, "Well, Mother, who must I talk with tonight? Shall it be Mrs. D?" "That deceitful woman? No, you shall not listen to her flattery." "Well, then, what do you say to Miss C?" "She is too young and handsome to practice deceit." "Young and handsome, you call her? You should not judge beauty for me. No, she is in league with Mrs. D, and you shall not talk with her." "Well, Mother, I must talk with someone. Is there anyone that you do not object to?" Trying to button his glove with a mock expression of gravity. "I don't know as it is necessary that you should talk to anybody in particular. You know well enough, Mr. Lincoln, that I do not approve of your flirtations with silly women, just as if you were a beardless boy fresh from school." "But, Mother, I insist that I must talk with somebody. I can't stand around like a simpleton and say nothing." "If you will not tell me who I may talk with, please tell me who I may not talk with." "There is Mrs. D and Miss C in particular. I detest them both. Mrs. B also will come around you, but you need not listen to her flattery. These are the ones in particular." "Very well, Mother, and now that we have settled the question to your satisfaction, we will go downstairs." He proffered his arm and led the way. End of chapter.